19-year-old Sophie Miller thought she had finally built a safe life. A tiny studio apartment near the University of Colorado, every window locked, every chain secured, every routine repeated twice. To her friends, she was paranoid. To Sophie, it was survival. But then came the night when she woke to the feeling of a hand on her arm. The room was empty, the chain on the door untouched, the windows still sealed. And yet, her clothes weren't the way she left them. Each night, the presence grew bolder, buttons slipping loose, fabric shifting, invisible hands stripping away her defenses. And each morning, Sophie was left trembling, too afraid to sleep, too terrified to stay awake. When she set up a camera for proof, what she saw nearly broke her mind. Clothing moving on its own, pulled by something that wasn't there. No intruder, no human explanation. Only a darkness that wanted more than fear. It wanted her. And the nightmare wasn't finished. This is the story of Sophie Miller, and the battle she fought when a relentless demon turned her nights into a prison of terror. Sophie Miller had always been careful about locking her doors. At 19, living alone in a cramped studio apartment near the University of Colorado Denver campus, she'd developed habits that most students her age would consider paranoid. Every window secured, every lock checked twice, security chain always engaged. Her friends thought she was overly cautious, but Sophie knew better. She had learned early that the world held dangers that most people preferred not to acknowledge. The memories from when she was 8 years old still haunted her dreams sometimes. An elderly neighbor who had seemed so kind, offering candy and friendly smiles. Her parents had trusted him completely until that terrible afternoon when everything changed. The betrayal, the whispered threats, the feeling of complete helplessness that carved itself into her young mind. Even now, 11 years later, Sophie struggled with relationships, especially with men. She'd only had 2 boyfriends in her life, both relationships ending quickly when her trauma responses kicked in. But tonight felt different. Despite the oppressive heat wave that had settled over Denver, Sophie had managed to fall into a deep sleep with her windows cracked open for the first time in months. The small, oscillating fan in the corner barely stirred the humid air, and she'd finally succumbed to exhaustion from her summer psychology courses. She didn't know what time it was when she first felt it. A presence in her room moving in the darkness. Something touched her arm, a gentle caress that sent ice through her veins. Sophie's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was pitch black, filled only with the distant hum of traffic and the whisper of her fan. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silence. Sophie fumbled for her bedside lamp, flooding the room with harsh yellow light. She scanned every corner, checked under the bed, examined the windows. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The security chain hung undisturbed on the door. The windows were still only cracked open a few inches, far too small for anyone to squeeze through. She spent the next 3 hours sitting in her desk chair, wide awake, watching the room until dawn crept through her blinds. By morning, she'd almost convinced herself it had been a dream. Almost. The next night, Sophie made sure every window was sealed tight and checked her locks 3 times before bed. She even pushed her dresser in front of the door as an extra precaution. But around 3 in the morning, she felt it again. A hand, definitely a hand, trailing along her shoulder and down her arm. This time, the touch lingered, fingers tracing patterns on her skin that made her stomach turn with revulsion. Sophie jerked awake with a strangled cry, but once again she was completely alone. The dresser remained exactly where she'd placed it. No signs of entry, no explanation for what she'd experienced. But this time, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. Her clothes had shifted, buttons no longer fastened as she remembered. 3 buttons that she clearly remembered fastening before bed now hung open. Sleep became impossible. Sophie paced her apartment until sunrise, checking and rechecking every possible entry point. She called in sick to her summer job at the campus bookstore and spent the day researching security systems online. By evening, she'd convinced herself that someone had to be getting in somehow. There had to be a logical explanation. 3 days passed without incident, and Sophie began to hope that whatever had happened was over. Maybe she really had been having extremely vivid nightmares brought on by stress and the heat. She returned to work, caught up on her reading assignments, and almost felt normal again. Then it happened for the third time. This time, the presence felt bolder, more aggressive. Sophie felt hands, definitely multiple hands, touching her face, her neck, her arms. The sensation was so real, so viscerally terrifying, that she couldn't force herself to wake up. In what felt like a dream but carried the weight of reality, she saw a figure leaning over her. Tall, masculine, with features that seemed to shift and blur whenever she tried to focus on them. Beautiful in a way that felt wrong, predatory. In the vision, the figure smiled as it stripped away every defense she had, leaving her utterly vulnerable. Sophie tried to scream, tried to fight, but her body wouldn't respond. She was trapped in her own mind, helpless once again, just like when she was 8 years old. When she finally managed to wrench herself awake, Sophie discovered that her clothes were disturbed, leaving her exposed and trembling, as if unseen hands had torn away her defenses. This time, there was no question that something real was happening. The fourth night, Sophie prepared. She set up her laptop to record video, positioned it to capture her entire bed. She also left a voice recorder running and scattered talcum powder around her room, anything that might capture evidence of an intruder. If someone was somehow getting into her apartment, she would have proof. But when the presence returned, stronger and more violent than before, Sophie experienced her worst nightmare coming true. The invisible force didn't just touch her, it actively began removing her clothes. She could feel fabric being pulled, buttons being undone. But she remained paralyzed, trapped between sleep and waking in a state of absolute terror. This time, when she finally broke free of the paralysis, Sophie found herself completely undressed. Her pajamas lay crumpled on the floor beside her bed. Shaking uncontrollably, she immediately checked her laptop recording. The video showed her sleeping peacefully for several hours. Then, around 2:30 in the morning, her clothes began to move. Slowly, deliberately, buttons slipped loose by itself. No hands were visible, no figure leaning over her, just her clothing being manipulated by an invisible force. The camera captured her fabric shifted downwards as if pulled by invisible hands, all while she remained apparently unconscious. Sophie watched the impossible footage 3 times before the full horror of her situation sank in. This wasn't a human intruder. This was something else entirely. Something that defied every rational explanation she could conceive. The next day, at the university library, Sophie approached her friend Jessica Morgan with desperation bordering on panic. Jessica was one of the few people Sophie trusted, a fellow psychology major who'd always been supportive and understanding about Sophie's past trauma. "Jess, I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound insane," Sophie began, keeping her voice low despite the relative privacy of their corner table. Jessica looked up from her textbook, immediately noting the dark circles under Sophie's eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly. "What's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days." Sophie took a shaky breath and explained everything. The mysterious touches, the displaced clothing, the impossible video evidence. She showed Jessica the recording on her laptop, watching her friend's expression shift from concern to confusion to outright disbelief. Sophie, I don't know what to say, Jessica whispered, staring at the screen. This isn't possible. I know how it sounds, but it's happening, and it's getting worse. I can't sleep in my apartment anymore. I can't handle being alone there. Sophie's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. Could I maybe stay with you for a few nights? Just until I figure out what to do? Jessica's face filled with sympathy, but she shook her head slowly. Sophie, I wish I could help, but my roommate's parents are visiting this week. Our couch is taken. And honestly, she hesitated, clearly struggling with her words. This whole thing really scares me. I mean, if something supernatural is really happening to you, what if it follows you to my place? The rejection hit Sophie like a physical blow. She understood Jessica's fear, but it didn't make the situation any less desperate. As she gathered her things to leave, fighting back tears of frustration and terror, a voice spoke from the table behind them. Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. Sophie turned to see a young man about her age, maybe slightly older, with kind brown eyes and an earnest expression. He had the clean-cut appearance of someone who took care of himself. Neat, dark hair, a simple button-down shirt, and an air of quiet confidence. I'm Nathan Collins, he said, standing and extending his hand. I work with the youth ministry at St. Mark's Episcopal Church downtown. I know this might sound strange, but if you need a safe place to stay, you're welcome at my apartment. I have a couch, and I promise you'd be completely safe. I wouldn't expect anything from you, and you'd have complete privacy. Sophie stared at him, unsure whether to be grateful or more terrified. The idea of staying with a complete stranger, especially a man, triggered every alarm bell her trauma had installed. But desperation was a powerful motivator. Why would you help me? She asked, suspicion evident in her voice. Nathan's expression remained gentle and understanding. Because I've seen things that most people wouldn't believe. In my work with the church, I've encountered situations that, well, let's say I'm more open-minded about unusual circumstances than most people. He pulled out his phone and showed her a contact card with the church's information. You can call St. Mark's and verify that I work there. I understand your hesitation, especially given what you're going through. Sophie looked at Jessica, who shrugged helplessly. It's your call, Soph. But you can't keep going without sleep. That evening, as darkness settled over Denver and Sophie felt her familiar dread returning, she found herself dialing Nathan's number. Her hands shook as she listened to the phone ring. Hello? Nathan? This is Sophie from the library. I think I need to take you up on your offer. Within an hour, Nathan arrived at her apartment. He carried a small overnight bag and immediately set about making her feel as comfortable as possible. He examined her apartment with surprising thoroughness, noting the secured windows and blocked door. I'll sleep on the living room couch, he assured her. If anything happens, anything at all, you just call out and I'll be right there. You're not alone in this anymore. Sophie felt a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety as she prepared for bed. Having another person in the apartment provided some comfort, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was tormenting her might not be deterred by human presence. Around midnight, as Sophie drifted into an uneasy sleep, the presence returned with renewed vengeance. This time, the dream felt more vivid than ever. She found herself in her bedroom, but Nathan was there too, standing in the doorway. In the vision, his kind expression had transformed into something predatory and hungry. Dream Nathan began removing his own clothes while approaching her bed with unmistakable intent. Sophie tried to scream, tried to wake herself up, but the nightmare held her captive. She watched in horror as the figure that looked like Nathan began to undress her, its hands cold and wrong against her skin. The sensation felt absolutely real, and the violation of trust made it even more terrifying than her previous encounters. When Sophie finally managed to break free of the dream with a blood-curdling scream, she discovered the worst possible scenario. She was completely naked, her pajamas torn and scattered around the bed. Standing in her doorway was the real Nathan, holding a large silver cross and looking absolutely terrified. But Nathan wasn't looking at her. His attention was fixed on something else in the room, a dark figure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The entity stood at the foot of Sophie's bed, tall and imposing, with features that shifted and writhed like smoke. It was beautiful in a way that hurt to perceive directly, and its eyes burned with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. "Stay back!" Nathan shouted, holding the cross forward like a weapon. "You have no power here!" The entity laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with distant thunder. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Foolish boy. You think your symbols can protect her from me? I have been feeding on her fear for weeks, growing stronger with each encounter. Tonight, I will claim what is mine." The demon, for Sophie now understood that's what she was dealing with, gestured casually toward Nathan. An invisible force picked him up and hurled him against the far wall with sickening impact. Nathan crumpled to the floor, dazed but still conscious. The entity turned its burning gaze back to Sophie, who clutched her bedsheets around herself in terror. "Tomorrow night, you will wait for me alone and willing, or I will take your life. No prayers, no protectors, no escape. You belong to me now." With that declaration, the demon vanished, leaving only the scent of sulfur and the echo of cruel laughter. Nathan struggled to his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Sophie, are you okay?" She nodded shakily, still processing what had just happened. What was that thing? A demon, a powerful one. Nathan's voice was grim. "And it's not finished with you." The next morning, Sophie and Nathan sat in a diner across town, both exhausted and shaken. Nathan had insisted they leave her apartment immediately, convinced that returning there would only make Sophie more vulnerable. "We need help," Nathan said, stirring his coffee absently. "This is beyond anything I've dealt with before." "Who could possibly help with something like this?" Sophie asked, her voice hollow with despair. "I know someone," Nathan said carefully. "An older man who helps people in situations like yours. I've never met him personally, but I've heard stories. People say he appears when someone really needs guidance." They spent the day walking through downtown Denver, both afraid to be alone and unsure of what to do. As evening approached, Sophie felt the familiar dread settling in her stomach. The demon's ultimatum echoed in her mind: submit willingly or be taken by force. It was just after sunset when they encountered him. The man appeared seemingly from nowhere as they walked past an alley near the cathedral. He was elderly, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. He wore a long, dark coat despite the summer heat, and his wide-brimmed hat cast shadows across his weathered face. "You've been struggling with something that defies explanation," he said to Sophie, his voice gentle but certain. "Something that threatens not just your body, but your very soul." Sophie stared at him in amazement. "How did you Who are you?" The man smiled mysteriously. "I'm someone who helps when conventional solutions aren't enough." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small silver cross, but this one was different from Nathan's. It seemed to glow with its own inner light, and Sophie could feel warmth radiating from it even from several feet away. "This isn't just blessed silver," the man explained. It's been touched by something pure, something that existed before evil learned to walk the earth. Wear it close to your heart tonight, and when the demon comes, and it will come, you must not submit. Fight back with every ounce of strength you possess. Show it that you choose light over darkness, courage over fear. But it's so powerful, Sophie whispered. How can I possibly resist it? Because, the old man said, placing the cross gently in her palm, true power doesn't come from domination or fear. It comes from the choice to stand up for what's right, even when everything seems hopeless. The demon feeds on your terror and helplessness. But if you can find even a moment of genuine courage, even the smallest spark of defiance, it will have to retreat. Nathan stepped forward. What about me? How can I help her? Stay close, but not too close, the man advised. Your presence will provide strength, but the battle must be hers to fight. Some victories can only be won by the person who's been victimized. With that cryptic advice, the old man tipped his hat and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Sophie and Nathan standing in the gathering darkness with more questions than answers. Before returning to her apartment, Nathan insisted they stop at St. Mark's. Using his access to the church, they searched behind the altar until Nathan found it. A small, ancient silver cross tucked away in a wooden box that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. The moment Sophie touched it, she felt an overwhelming sense of warmth and protection. That night, Sophie returned to her apartment alone, as the demon had demanded. But she wasn't truly alone. Nathan waited in his car across the street, ready to intervene if necessary. The mysterious cross hung around her neck, warm against her skin and somehow comforting despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. Sophie lay in her bed, still fully clothed, watching the clock as it approached midnight. When the presence materialized in her room, it was stronger and more tangible than ever before. The demon stood at the foot of her bed in its full, terrible glory, beautiful and horrifying in equal measure. You returned, it said, sounding pleased, and you wear a trinket around your neck. Do you really think that will save you? Sophie's hand instinctively went to the cross. The moment her fingers touched it, she felt a surge of warmth and strength that she hadn't expected. I'm not afraid of you anymore. The demon laughed. Brave words. But I can smell your fear, taste it in the air. You've been terrified of me for weeks. Yes, I have been, Sophie admitted, sitting up in bed. But I've been terrified of a lot of things for most of my life, and I'm tired of letting fear control me. The entity's expression shifted slightly, becoming less confident. You will submit to me willingly, or I will take you by force. No, Sophie said firmly, standing up from her bed. The cross grew warmer against her chest. I won't submit, and you can't take anything from me that I don't give you. The demon snarled and lunged forward, but the moment it came within arm's reach of Sophie, the cross blazed with brilliant light. The entity recoiled with a shriek of pain and rage. You think you've won, it hissed. This changes nothing. I'll return again and again until you break. Then I'll be ready, Sophie said, her voice growing stronger with each word. Every time you come back, I'll be here. I'll be stronger. And eventually you'll get tired of losing and find someone else to bother. The demon's form began to waver, becoming less solid. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Sophie replied with conviction she hadn't felt in years. It's over because I say it's over. You have no power here anymore. With a final shriek of frustrated rage, the demon vanished completely. The oppressive weight that had hung over Sophie's apartment for weeks lifted instantly, replaced by a sense of peace and safety that felt almost miraculous. Sophie collapsed back onto her bed, emotionally drained but victorious. Moments later, Nathan burst through her door. She'd given him a spare key earlier, and found her laughing and crying simultaneously. "It's gone," she told him through her tears. "It's really gone." In the days that followed, Sophie's life began to return to normal. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully, returned to work, and caught up on her studies. More importantly, she found herself drawn to Nathan's gentle kindness and unwavering support. What had begun as a desperate alliance slowly developed into something deeper. 3 weeks after the demon's final defeat, Sophie and Nathan were sitting in the same diner where they'd planned their desperate strategy. Their relationship had evolved naturally, from mutual support to genuine affection, and Sophie found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. "I want to thank that old man," Sophie said, absently touching the cross that she still wore every day. "He saved my life." "I've been thinking about that too," Nathan replied. "I should introduce you to Father Miguel at St. Mark's. Maybe he knows who the man was." The next Sunday, Sophie accompanied Nathan to the small Episcopal church where he volunteered. Father Miguel was a friendly, middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines around his eyes. When Nathan described their mysterious helper, however, the priest's expression grew puzzled. "I'm sorry," Father Miguel said, shaking his head, "but that doesn't sound like anyone I know. And I've been at St. Mark's for 15 years. I know all the regular congregants and most of the clergy in the area." Sophie felt a familiar chill. "Could you describe the priest you're thinking of?" Father Miguel nodded and pulled out his phone, scrolling to a photo from a recent church conference. "This is Father Williams from Sacred Heart Cathedral. He's been doing spiritual counseling work for over 20 years. The photos showed a man who looked nothing like their mysterious helper. Father Williams was shorter, stockier, with blonde hair and blue eyes. He appeared to be in his 40s, not his 70s, and bore no resemblance whatsoever to the man who had given Sophie the cross. Nathan and Sophie exchanged glances, the same realization dawning on both of them simultaneously. Their helper hadn't been human at all. "Who do you think he really was?" Sophie asked as they walked back to Nathan's car. Nathan considered the question carefully. "I don't know. But does it matter? He helped you when you needed it most. Maybe that's all we need to understand." Sophie nodded, touching the cross again. Whatever force had sent the mysterious man to help her, she was grateful. For the first time since childhood, she felt truly safe. More than that, she felt strong enough to face whatever challenges life might bring. The demon never returned. Sophie completed her psychology degree, eventually specializing in trauma counseling to help others who had faced similar ordeals. She and Nathan married 2 years later in a small ceremony at St. Mark's, with Father Miguel officiating. Sometimes, late at night, Sophie would catch glimpses of a tall figure in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, standing under streetlights or walking through shadows. She never approached these sightings, understanding instinctively that their guardian's work was done, but she always felt a warm sense of protection and gratitude when she saw him. The silver cross remained around her neck always, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, help could come from the most unexpected sources. And whenever her clients shared stories that seemed to defy rational explanation, Sophie knew exactly how to respond. "Tell me everything," she would say, leaning forward with complete attention. "And don't worry about whether I'll believe you. Some things in this world are real whether we understand them or not." Because Sophie Miller had learned firsthand that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about standing up and fighting back, even when everything seemed hopeless. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to change everything.